There's a farmhouse in western Pennsylvania that hasn't been lived in since 1998. The locals won't go near it after dark. Not because of ghost stories or urban legends, but because of what was found in the walls during a renovation attempt in 2003, 7 small wooden boxes, each no bigger than a shoebox hidden between the studs of the nursery. Inside each one, wrapped in moth-eaten christening gowns, were the remains of infants. All boys, all twins, all buried in secret over the course of 140 years. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as undetermined, but the investigator noted something strange in his personal notes, something that was never made public. Each infant had bruising consistent with smothering. Each one died within hours of birth, and every single one of them was a twin. The Langley family owned that house for 6 generations. They were respected. Church-going, quiet, the kind of family that keeps to itself and minds its business. But in 2003, when those boxes were opened, a secret came to light that the family had protected with silence, ritual, and blood. A tradition so dark that even now, over 2 decades later, the surviving members refuse to speak about it on record. This is the story of the Langley bloodline. A family bound not by love, but by a curse they believed was real, and the one man who finally broke it. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The tradition began in 1862 during the second year of the Civil War. Thomas Langley, a Pennsylvania farmer and Union soldier, returned home on leave to find his wife Martha in labor. She gave birth to twin boys in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse, delivered by a midwife named Clara Howe. According to Clara's diary, which was discovered in a historical society archive in 1976, something happened in that room that she described as unnatural and against God's design. The first twin was born healthy, crying immediately. The second came out silent, blue around the lips, but breathing. Martha, exhausted and feverish, looked at both boys and whispered something to Thomas that Clara couldn't quite hear. But what she wrote next has haunted researchers ever since. Thomas took the silent one from my arms. He told me it was mercy. He said the land wouldn't take 2. 3 hours later, the second twin was dead. Clara wrote that she tried to intervene, but Thomas stood in the doorway and told her that some things were older than law, older than church, that his father had done the same, and his grandfather before him. He said the Langley land had a price and twins were a sign that the soil was hungry. If both boys lived, the farm would fail, the crops would rot, the family would starve. It was superstition, yes, but it was also survival. And in 1862, in rural Pennsylvania, survival wasn't a metaphor. It was life or death. Clara left the Langley farm that night and never returned. In her diary, she wrote that she considered going to the authorities, but she knew it would be her word against a respected family. She wrote that she prayed for forgiveness, not for Thomas, but for herself, because she had stood there and let it happen. And then she wrote something chilling. I have delivered 11 children for the Langleys. Over the years, I have seen 3 sets of twins. Only 3 firstborns survived. The pattern continued for generations, hidden in plain sight. In 1889, Thomas Langley's son, William, had twin boys. The second one died of respiratory failure within 6 hours of birth. In 1907, William's son, Robert, had twins. The younger twin was listed as stillborn, though the attending doctor noted in his private records that the infant had been alive when he left the room. In 1933, Robert's son, James, had twins during the height of the Great Depression. The second boy died in his sleep before sunrise. No autopsy was ever performed. The local physician, Dr. Harold Vance, signed the death certificate without question. He'd been the Langley family doctor for over 20 years. He knew not to ask. What's remarkable is how unremarkable it appeared. Infant mortality was high in those days, especially in rural areas. Twin births were considered risky. A second twin, dying shortly after birth, while tragic, wasn't unusual enough to raise suspicion. The Langleys attended church every Sunday. They donated to charity. They helped their neighbors during hard times. No one suspected that behind closed doors they were practicing a ritual that had been passed down farther. To sun for nearly a century, and the farm, despite droughts and depressions and wars, always produced the Langley. Land never failed, but there was a cost beyond the dead infants. The surviving sons grew up knowing what had been done. They grew up understanding that they had lived because their brother had died. Some handled it better than others. Robert Langley became a recluse in his later years, rarely leaving the farmhouse. James Langley drank himself to death at 52. His widow told a neighbor years later that he used to wake up screaming about a baby crying in the walls. She thought he was having nightmares. She didn't know he was hearing ghosts, or maybe in some terrible way he was hearing memory, the memory of what he had done to his own sons. In 1968, James Langley's son, Robert Jr., became a father. His wife, Catherine, went into labor on a cold November night. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes away, but Catherine insisted on a home birth. She wanted her mother there. She wanted familiar walls around her. Robert Jr. agreed, though, according to his younger brother's testimony, years later he looked pale and distant the entire day. He knew what was coming. He'd known since he was old enough to understand. His father had told him when he was 16, sitting in the barn with a bottle of whiskey between them. "If you have twins, boy, you do what's right. You do what keeps this family alive." Catherine gave birth to twin boys just after midnight. Both came out screaming. Both were healthy. The midwife, a woman named Alice Brennan, cleaned them and wrapped them and handed them to Catherine, who wept with joy. She had no idea. Robert Jr. stood in the corner of the room, silent, staring at his sons like a man facing execution. Alice left around 2 o'clock in the morning, satisfied that mother and children were stable. She told Catherine to call if there were any problems. She never got a call. By dawn, one of the twins was dead. Catherine found him in the bassinet, cold and still, his tiny face pressed into the mattress. She screamed. She called for Robert. He came running, and when he saw the baby, he fell to his knees and sobbed, not the controlled, quiet grief of a man mourning, the raw, broken crying of a man who just committed murder. Catherine didn't understand. She thought it was crib death, sudden infant death syndrome, a tragedy but not a crime. Robert never told her the truth. He carried that secret until the day he died in 2001, but his brother knew. And years later, in a recorded interview with a local historian, he said something that still sends chills down the spine. Bobby didn't want to do it. He stood over that crib for 3 hours just staring. But he did it anyway because he was more afraid of the curse than he was of God. Robert Jr.'s surviving son was named Thomas. After the first Langley to start the tradition, he grew up quiet and observant, the kind of boy who listened more than he spoke. He left the farm at 18 to attend college in Pittsburgh, studying history and philosophy. He rarely came home. When his father died in 2001, Thomas returned for the funeral, but he didn't stay. He sold most of the farmland, kept the house, and moved to Philadelphia. He became a teacher. He married a woman named Sarah, a nurse from New Jersey, who knew nothing about the Langley family history, and in 2007 Sarah became pregnant. The ultrasound at 20 weeks showed 2 heartbeats. Twin boys. Sarah was ecstatic. Thomas went silent. That night, he sat at the kitchen table until 3 o'clock in the morning, staring at nothing. Sarah asked him what was wrong. He told her he needed to tell her something, but he didn't know how. So, he drove her to the farmhouse in Pennsylvania, to the place he'd spent his entire adult life trying to forget. And in the nursery, the room where generations of Langley's sons had been born and died, he told her everything. Sarah didn't believe him at first. She thought it was some kind of psychological break, some manifestation of anxiety about becoming a father. But Thomas showed her the boxes in the walls. He showed her the christening gowns, the small bones, the dates carved into the wood. He showed her his father's journal hidden in the attic where Robert Jr. had written a single entry the night after his son died. "I have become my father. I have become the thing I swore I'd never be. God forgive me because I cannot forgive myself." Sarah left the farmhouse that day in shock. She didn't speak to Thomas for 3 days, but when she finally did, she said something that changed everything. "If you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you touch our children, you're insane. We're breaking this right now, tonight, forever. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most." Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Thomas and Sarah's twin boys were born in March of 2008 at Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. Both came out healthy. Both were crying. Both had strong heartbeats and perfect Apgar scores. The doctors congratulated them. The nurses brought the babies to Sarah's room wrapped in blue blankets, their tiny faces peaceful and unaware of the history they carried in their blood. Thomas held his sons for the first time and felt something break inside him. Not in a bad way, in the way a dam breaks when the water finally has somewhere to go. He wept. Sarah wept. And for the first time in 146 years, both Langley twins went home alive. But the fear didn't end there. Thomas became obsessive. He checked on the boys every hour through the night. He installed cameras in the nursery. He barely slept. Sarah tried to reassure him that the curse wasn't real, that it had always been a choice, a terrible tradition disguised as fate. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, that the land, the house, the ghosts of all those murdered infants were circling, patient and hungry. He started researching his family history in earnest, reaching out to distant relatives, tracking down birth and death records, trying to understand how far back the tradition really went. What he found was worse than he imagined. The Langley family had immigrated from England in 1743 in the Old Country. They'd been tenant farmers, working land owned by a nobleman who practiced folk rituals that predated Christianity. Thomas found a reference in a genealogy book to a blood tithe required of families who worked cursed soil. If twins were born, one had to be returned to the earth or the land would take everything. The Langleys brought that belief with them to America. They brought it to Pennsylvania. And they fed it generation after generation until it became truth, not because it was real, but because they made it real. Because belief, when it's strong enough and dark enough, becomes its own kind of curse. The boys grew up healthy. They turned 1, then 2, then 5. Thomas waited for disaster. He waited for the crops to fail. Even though he didn't farm anymore, he waited for financial ruin, for accidents, for some sign that breaking the tradition had consequences. Nothing happened. The boys thrived. They started school. They made friends. They were normal, happy children who had no idea that their existence was an act of rebellion against a century and a half of family horror. But Thomas couldn't let it go. He became obsessed with the farmhouse, with the idea that the truth needed to be exposed, that the Langley family's crimes needed to be documented and acknowledged. In 2012, he contacted a local journalist and told her everything. She didn't believe him at first either until he showed her the evidence. The boxes, the bones, the journals. She wrote an article that ran in a regional paper, but it didn't gain much attention. A few historians reached out. A paranormal investigation team wanted to film at the house. Thomas refused. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't a ghost story. This was murder. Repeated across generations, normalized and sanctified, and hidden behind closed doors. In 2013, Thomas donated the farmhouse to a historical preservation society with one condition: that the nursery remain exactly as it was found, boxes and all, as a memorial to the children who died there. The house stands empty now. Occasionally, school groups visit as part of local history programs. They learn about colonial farming practices and Civil War-era life. But they also learn about the Langley twins, about the boys who were killed not out of rage or madness, but out of tradition, out of fear, out of a belief system that valued land over life. Thomas Langley still lives in Philadelphia. His sons are 17 now, both alive, both aware of the history they carry. He's never returned to the farmhouse. He says he doesn't need to. The curse, if it ever existed, is broken. Not because the land released them, but because he chose his children over his fear. But here's what haunts researchers who've studied the Langley case. In the 2003 investigation, forensic analysis was done on the infant remains. All 7 showed signs of asphyxiation. But there was something else, something the coroner noted but couldn't explain. The bones showed evidence of rapid deterioration far beyond what would be expected given the preservation. Conditions as if something had been feeding on them. Slowly over decades, the soil samples taken from inside the boxes contained compounds that don't naturally occur in Pennsylvania farmland. Compounds that are typically only found in places where human remains have decomposed and saturated the earth over long periods of time. The Langley farm produced crops for 150 years without fail, even during the Dust Bowl when neighboring farms turned to dust. The Langley land stayed fertile, even during floods and freezes and droughts. Make of that what you will. Maybe it was luck, maybe it was good farming, or maybe some old beliefs survive because they're fed. And maybe Thomas Langley didn't break a curse, maybe he just stopped feeding it, and now, for the first time in over a century, it's finally starving. If you made it this far, leave a comment and let us know what you think. Was it superstition or something darker? We'll see you in the next.